Imagine a figure so terrifying that his mere name sent tremors through the mighty Roman Empire. A leader who struck fear into the hearts of rulers and common folk alike. A man who carved his name into history with blood and thunder. Attila the Hun, the Scourge of God, was not just a conqueror. He was a living force of nature, unstoppable and merciless, sweeping across the land like a whirlwind, reshaping the very face of Europe in his wake. This is the story of a man who turned history on its head and made even the most powerful empires tremble before him. In the 5th century, Europe was in a state of upheaval. The Western Roman Empire, once an unshakable titan, was slowly crumbling under the pressure of invasions from all sides. The world was waiting for someone to seize control of the chaos. That someone was Attila, a man born to lead the fierce Huns, a nomadic people from the distant steppes of Central Asia, known for their ruthless prowess in battle and their unyielding thirst for conquest. Attila's rise was swift and brutal. As a young leader, he was not born into an empire or a kingdom, but into a warrior's world, one where strength, cunning, and the will to dominate were the only currencies that mattered. His life is a legend of bloodshed and ambition, a tale where the line between myth and reality blurs into one relentless pursuit of power. But where did Attila come from? To understand the man, we must look to his origins. He was born around 406 AD, possibly in modern-day Hungary, to the powerful Hun leader Munzuk. The Huns, often portrayed as barbaric marauders, were a people of unmatched ferocity. Their culture was built on the strength of the horse, the bow, and the relentless drive to conquer. But Attila was no ordinary warrior. He was a child of destiny, groomed for greatness from the moment he drew his first breath. The very fact that he was born into a world of such violence shaped his mindset for life. Victory or death. His family's power came from the unity of the Huns, and Attila's rise to power was marked by his ability to forge alliances and crush his enemies with brutal efficiency. Attila didn't achieve power through sheer bloodline alone. He shared rule of the Huns with his brother, Bleda, after the death of their uncle, Rugila. But Attila's ambition was far greater than his brother's. There was a tension between them, an unspoken rivalry, one that Attila would ultimately settle in a way that would change the course of history. In 444 AD, Attila did the unthinkable. He killed his own brother, seizing full control of the Huns. This act of fratricide, brutal and unforgiving, solidified his status as the undisputed leader of the Huns. But it also marked the beginning of a reign that would send shockwaves throughout Europe. The death of Bleda was not just a personal tragedy. It was a sign that Attila was a man who would stop at nothing to claim his place at the top. With full control of the Huns, Attila's ambition expanded. He was not just a tribal leader, he was a conqueror with a vision. Unlike many of his predecessors, Attila did not seek only plunder. He sought to build a vast empire, one that could rival the greatest civilizations of the time, the Romans. Under his leadership, the Huns would go on to forge an empire that stretched from the steppes of Asia all the way to the gates of Rome. Attila's army was a well-oiled machine, ruthless in its tactics and unparalleled in its speed. They were masters of the mounted archery, able to rain arrows down upon their enemies before they even knew what hit them. The Huns were relentless, and they struck fear into anyone who dared to stand in their way. The first major clash between Attila and the Romans came in 451 AD, when the Huns, under Attila's command, invaded Gaul. This was the moment when Attila's legend truly began to grow. The Romans, led by the great general Flavius Aetius, stood against Attila's forces at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. The battle was fierce, and though the Romans were able to repel Attila's forces, they could not destroy him. The Huns, despite suffering heavy losses, withdrew, choosing to fight another day. This was Attila's genius. He knew when to fight and when to retreat, keeping his enemies guessing, never giving them the satisfaction of a decisive victory. It was this strategy that allowed him to remain a constant, terrifying threat to the Romans for the rest of his life. But Attila was not just a military genius, he was a master of psychological warfare. He understood the power of fear, how it could shatter an enemy's resolve and make them more likely to submit to his will. Attila's reputation was built not only on his conquests, but on the sheer terror he inspired. He was a figure who seemed almost larger than life, a force of nature that could not be contained. His very presence on the battlefield was enough to send entire cities into panic. It's said that the mere mention of his name caused entire villages to flee in terror, and that his armies left behind nothing but devastation in their wake. For the Romans, Attila represented an existential threat. He was the embodiment of chaos, a dark force that threatened to bring an end to their centuries-old empire. However, Attila's story is not one of mindless destruction. Despite his bloodthirsty reputation, he was a shrewd diplomat and a man of complex political ambitions. He recognized the power of alliances, and he knew that in order to achieve his goals, he needed to manipulate the political landscape of Europe. He was no mere barbarian. Attila understood the intricacies of diplomacy, and he used his reputation to force the Western Roman Empire into paying him vast sums of gold in exchange for peace. In 452 AD, Attila's Huns turned their attention to Italy, laying waste to the northern cities and marching toward Rome. The Pope, Leo the famously met with Attila to negotiate peace. What transpired in that meeting remains a subject of mystery and speculation. Some say that Leo's faith, combined with the sight of a miraculous storm, convinced Attila to spare Rome. But whatever the reason, Attila turned back, and the city of Rome was spared, for the time being. Yet, even as Attila's empire reached its zenith, cracks were beginning to appear. The Huns, much like the empires they sought to conquer, were a people built on constant warfare. The idea of maintaining control over such vast territories was an impossible task. In 453 AD, after a successful campaign in Italy, Attila died under mysterious circumstances. Some say he was struck down by a stroke, while others claim he was assassinated by his own people. Whatever the cause, his death marked the end of an era. His empire, which had stretched from the Caspian Sea to the heart of Europe, quickly began to unravel. Without Attila's strong hand to guide them, the Huns lost their cohesion, and within a few short years, their empire disintegrated. Attila's death left a void in the power structures of Europe, but his legacy lived on. The Scourge of God had come and gone, but the fear he had instilled in the hearts of his enemies would linger for centuries. For the Romans, for the Germans, and for the people of Europe, Attila represented a dark chapter in their history, a reminder of the brutal force that had once threatened to crush them. Yet in some ways, he also represented something else, the embodiment of a force that was untamable, a symbol of the power of the nomadic world and its ability to reshape the fate of empires. Attila was more than just a man, he was a phenomenon. His name lives on as a symbol of fear, a reminder of a time when the very fabric of Europe was shaken by a figure who had no equal. But history is often more complicated than it seems. Was Attila simply a barbarian warlord, or was he a visionary who sought to build an empire that could stand the test of time? Perhaps in the end, he was both, a brutal conqueror and a shrewd strategist, a man who embodied the paradoxes of his time. And that, perhaps, is what makes his story so fascinating, so timeless, and so enduring. The life of Attila the Hun remains one of history's greatest mysteries, a tale of power, fear, and ambition that continues to captivate the imagination of people all over the world. In the end, the legend of Attila the Hun is a testament to the power of an individual to shape the world around them, to carve their name into history with the force of their will. His story, though long gone, continues to echo across the centuries, a reminder that even the greatest empires can fall before a force as raw and unstoppable as Attila. Attila's legacy, however, is more than just a tale of conquest and destruction. It is a story of the fragile nature of power, the fleeting nature of empires, and the relentless march of history. While the Roman Empire crumbled under the weight of its own internal struggles, Attila's brief yet intense rise to power exposed the vulnerabilities of even the most enduring civilizations. The shockwaves of his campaigns reverberated long after his death, influencing the course of European history in ways that are still felt today. What remains particularly fascinating about Attila's story is the way in which he transcended the simple role of a barbarian warlord. His understanding of leadership and his ability to unite disparate tribes under his banner speak to a cunning and vision beyond mere brute strength. The Huns, who were initially seen as little more than a savage horde, became a formidable empire under his rule, and Attila's strategic foresight set him apart from other conquerors of the era. Unlike the Romans, who often relied on entrenched power structures and bureaucracy, Attila's strength lay in his ability to inspire loyalty through fear, charisma, and ruthless ambition. His people followed him not only because they feared him, but also because they recognized the strength of his vision. A vision of a unified nomadic empire that could rival the great powers of Europe. Attila's ability to manipulate the political landscape of Europe also cannot be overstated. He used diplomacy as much as he used his sword, often negotiating from a position of strength, extracting tribute from the Romans, and intimidating his neighbors into submission. His dealings with the Eastern Roman Empire and his eventual negotiations with the Pope in 452 AD show a side of Attila that went beyond the battlefield. These negotiations marked the height of his power and influence, showcasing a leader who understood the value of alliances and the need for political leverage in a world where military might alone was not always enough. But even as Attila appeared to be at the height of his power, there were signs of instability beneath the surface. His empire was built on conquest, and the very nature of that empire made it difficult to sustain. The Huns were a nomadic people, and their way of life, while effective in battle, was not designed for long-term governance. Attila's death, though sudden and mysterious, highlighted the fragility of his empire. Without his commanding presence, the coalition of tribes that made up his forces began to fracture. The Huns, whose unity had been forged in the fires of war, quickly found themselves divided, and the empire Attila had built crumbled as swiftly as it had risen. Yet, despite the collapse of his empire, Attila's impact on European history cannot be denied. His campaigns forever changed the landscape of Europe, contributing to the eventual fall of the Western Roman Empire. His invasions, though devastating, also played a role in the shifting of power in the region. They opened the door for new civilizations to emerge, such as the kingdoms of the Franks, Visigoths, and Ostrogoths, who would go on to carve out their own empires in the wake of the Roman collapse. In many ways, Attila's reign was a catalyst for the transformation of Europe from the classical world into the medieval era. What is perhaps most remarkable about Attila's legacy is how it has been shaped over time. He has been immortalized in both history and legend, often portrayed as a monstrous figure, a destroyer of civilizations. Yet there are also those who view him as a tragic hero, a man of great potential who was undone by his own ruthless nature. The line between villain and visionary is often blurred in his story, and the complexity of his character continues to intrigue scholars and historians. In the final analysis, Attila the Hun was both a product of his time and a figure who transcended it. His actions, driven by ambition, fear, and a desire for power, left an indelible mark on history. The Huns, under his leadership, were more than just a force of destruction. They were a reminder of the fragile nature of empires and the unpredictable tides of history. In his rise and fall, Attila embodied the paradox of empire building, that even the greatest of rulers are, in the end, vulnerable to the very forces they seek to control. And while Attila's empire may have dissolved after his death, his name, like the winds of the steppe that carried his armies, continues to haunt the pages of history.